This is my childhood, or so it seemed. This is what it felt like. I lived in this wonderful place growing up, and there's a picture that really demonstrates how beautiful it was. It was magical and wonderful. And I had a wonderful neighbor. Her name was Cassandra. She was the most beautiful Aboriginal girl I've ever seen. And I loved her as much as a 5-year-old could love anyone. And we played together. My life was rich with play as a child. And I believe my life was better because of it. Fast forward 30 years, and this is my neighbor, also Aboriginal. Today I'm sharing the story with you of how I went from loving my neighbor to judging my neighbor. And I call it Who Moved My Damn Unicorn? Living downtown Winnipeg, I would walk to work every day, and I would pass my neighbors. Often they would be passed out on the street. They would be asking for change, and I would spare some to them. But I realized that something was different, and I was troubled by this. I yearned for that magic of play, that wonder and curiosity and experience of a child, and I even went back to where I grew up as a child. And I found out it wasn't quite the same as I remember. My house wasn't quite as big as I thought it was. The street wasn't quite as clean. I realized growing up I was probably poorer than I thought. Rich in play, but poor in money. And what I came to realize is it wasn't that circumstance had changed, it was that something inside of me had changed. And this troubled me. But what troubled me the most was that I was no longer loving my neighbor, that I was judging them. And I thought I would face this topic head on. And I had a conversation with a good friend of mine named Danae, who's also Aboriginal, and I said, I need your help with this. I'm really struggling because I don't want to buy in to a stereotype that I've heard and rejected my whole life, that I knew it was not true. But every day as I go out, I'm seeing it validated. I don't want to believe it, but I'm seeing all this proof around me otherwise. Please help me. And she looked at me with this disturbed and disgusted look, and she said, Joseph, you're racist. And I said, how could I be racist? I once married an Asian woman. My childhood friend was Aboriginal. I went to the reserves, both as a child and as an adult. And she interrupted me and she said, Joseph, I've never lived on a reserve. Both of my parents were university educated. I am more suburban than you are. And then she told me of the time that she was out for dinner with a friend. And somebody walked up to their table and congratulated her for being on a date with a white man. She told me the story of how she went to the bank, and the teller, who probably made half as much as she did, congratulated her for having a job like a white person would. She asked me, she said, Joseph, have you ever asked these people that you're judging what their story is? Have you ever gotten to know them? And I said, no, I hadn't. She said I was dehumanizing them. And then she asked me if I had ever heard of the residential schools program. And I am both ashamed and relieved that as a 34-year-old Canadian, I had never heard of the residential schools program before. The residential schools program has been described as a cultural genocide. The words that you see on this screen come from an official letter of apology issued by the Prime Minister of Canada. It's a program that for over 120 years, Aboriginal children were stolen from their homes and placed into boarding schools, where their culture, their language, who they were was pulled away from them. And I started to ask myself as I learned about this, how would I turn out if at 5 years old I was stolen from my family? What if from age 5 to 18, every single day, I was being told that who I was at a fundamental level was bad? What if I was told that I was less than others because of something beyond my control, something so trivial as the color of my skin? Or even worse, what if I was physically abused, molested, or even raped? Would I need to heal from those experiences? You bet I would. But what if my entire support system had been through the same experiences? And what if they weren't given the tools and support that they needed to heal? These Aboriginal cultures are beautiful, and the goal of the residential schools program was to kill them. I remember a story. Years ago, I volunteered at a community center in the inner city. And there was a young girl there. She was 5, coincidentally the same age as my beautiful exotic princess, Cassandra. And she was nasty. Nobody liked her at this community center because she was mean and rude, and she would yell and swear at everybody, including the adults. I thought, how does a 5-year-old do this? And I thought, I'll take a lesson from my mom. I'm going to overcome this with kindness. And so I asked her, I said, what do you want to be when you grow up? She looked at me like I was an idiot. She said, what do you mean? And I said, well, when you're older and you grow up, what kind of job would you like to have? And she looked at me and she said, jobs are for white people. I'm an Indian. When I grow up, I will be on welfare. And hearing a story like that makes me realize that the residential schools program has since been shut down, but it's still having an impact. The goal of the residential schools program was to kill the Indian in the child. But this is the thing. People are not Indians. People are not white people. These are just labels. And no matter how desperately we try to put labels on people, whether race, religion, sexual orientation, whatever, you cannot attack a label. You can only attack a person or the people behind the label. This was not a crime against a minority group. This was a crime against humanity. And this is not an issue about us versus them. This is an issue about what we have done to each other, what we've done to ourselves. In searching to try and resolve this problem within me, and that's where it lies, I've discovered what I call a recipe for compassion. It's very simple and very powerful. It has 3 ingredients. They are 3 concepts, 3 beliefs or ideas that, if embraced fully, in any situation, it will automatically take you from one of judgment to one of compassion and love. The first idea is this, is that people work perfectly. This is a hard one for me, coming from the world of personal development, personal growth, that always talks about improving and getting better. To admit that nobody is broken is a hard concept. But just like a computer code, and I'm sure you've had that experience where someone said, the computer didn't do what it was supposed to, right? Computers do exactly what they're supposed to do, but it's based on user input, based on variables. They work exactly the way that they're supposed to. And so it is with us as people. We work perfectly based on the variables in our lives. Number 2, people do the best that they can with what they have. I'm reminded of a story that a friend told me years ago, that there was a group of people, and among them there was a friend that nobody liked. He was obnoxious and abrasive and rude. And one day when he wasn't there, they asked this other guy, they said, how can you be so kind and patient, tolerant and accepting of him? And he said quite simply, next time you see him, ask to see his feet. So the next time they were all together and he was in the crowd, they said, hey, show us your feet. So he kicked off his shoe, he unrolled his sock, and he put his foot up on the table. And on the bottom, there were these little round marks, scars. And they said, "What are those from?" And he said, "When I was a child and I cried and my parents didn't like it, they would pick me up. And they would hold me over the stove and put my feet on the burner as a form of discipline." Abrasive? You bet he was. He was doing the best that he could with what he had. The third idea is that underlying every behavior is a positive intention. And behaviors can be healthy, they can be unhealthy. There's no arguing that. But behind them is always a positive intention. And you see that often psychologists, they will talk about, in cases of serial killers, that however unhealthy this behavior may be, they were trying to satisfy something. They were either running from pain or working toward pleasure, or really quite often it's about love. It's in some misaligned way, our unhealthy behaviors are about finding love. I was able to do this for an individual, like the guy who cuts you off in traffic, right? I'm not the one honking on the horn and flipping him the bird. I'm the one saying, "You know what, he must have had a fight with his partner this morning. Or maybe he's stressed about money." I could be compassionate. But I wasn't able to do this to a collective. Further proof that my friend Danae was right, that I was dehumanizing people. I wasn't applying it to an individual. So in summary, the three ingredients quite simply are that people work perfectly, that people do the best that they can with what they have, and underlying every behavior is a positive intention. I'll give you an example. Among my circle of friends, and maybe this is something you can relate to, when a friend goes through a nasty breakup, and he's really torn up, typically he'll go on a bender. He'll go out and he'll drink a little bit too much and maybe do some things that aren't the wisest decisions. But do we judge him? No. He's going through a hard time. We know he's just trying to deal with the pain. Well, a few weeks ago, I had a conversation with Chief Dennis Whitebird, and he said, "You know what? Alcohol is a problem among some of our people." And then he told me the story that at 15, he ran away from the residential schools. He said, "I didn't like it. I wanted to go back and be with my family." When the Indian agent in town heard that he was back home, he threatened his mother and said, "If you do not send him back, we will send you to jail." And then he said this, he said, they turned to alcohol because they had nothing left to live for. When their children were taken from them, the love was gone. How would I deal with this? How would I cope if my children were stolen from me? How would I cope if the very system designed to protect me and my family was the same one that stole them from me and was abusing them? So I've learned that instead of judging people, we need to love them. We need to stop pointing fingers, and we need to start holding hands, because we're all people. Every one of us, we're all in this together. We all bleed red. It takes courage to challenge our assumptions, to be vulnerable. It takes courage to admit our mistakes. It takes courage to ask for help. But this is what we need to do. Just making an assumption and applying a label is the path of least resistance. It's cowardice. And we deserve much better. I believe that we can have a positive impact, that we can have a huge change on this planet, and there are opportunities all around us. I realized that the problem wasn't that someone had moved my unicorn. The problem was that I was racist. Instead of taking the time to know my neighbor, to listen to their stories, I was just judging them. I'll tell you a story. I was driving up Main Street one day years ago, and I saw a woman on the side of the road. She had her thumb out, and she was looking for a ride. And a couple buddies in the car, and I said, "Oh, well, give her a ride." And they said, "Wait, she's probably drunk. She's probably on drugs. She needs a ride." So I gave her a ride. Drove her up just a couple blocks, and that was it. But the whole time that we drove, she's like, "I can't believe you gave me a ride. You're so nice. You're so kind." I'm like, "You asked for a ride. We gave you a ride." I gave her my email address at the end and never heard from her again. until about a year later. She emailed me and she said, Joseph, I want you to know something. That day, I changed my plans. When you dropped me off, I didn't go home to my boyfriend, who was abusive and mean. I checked myself into rehab. I now live in a different town. I have a job. I've turned my life around. 10 years later, she is now happily married and has a loving family of her own. Her world was changed by an act of love, but know this, it was only a ride. That was it. We all have these opportunities. Ignorance may be bliss, but change, progress, growth, improvement, those come through awareness. They come through sharing our stories. And I hope that by me sharing my story with you, I can make it true that I was racist. Past tense. And I think there's an opportunity for all of us to come together as one, to embrace a vision of something and share our stories of what we believe is possible, to share our stories of weakness, of failure with one another. And if you're so inclined, I invite you to come and share your stories at iwasracist.com. I've set that up so we can start to share our stories. But I believe that by doing this, that we can close this sad chapter in our history, and we can open up a brand new one. One full of love and understanding. One that is rooted in the truth that we are all one. Thank you.